Hey everybody, welcome back. Wayne here. We at Fair Recovery certainly hope you guys are staying safe and healthy during this crazy time on our planet. This week I'm going to talk about a question that shows up in my office fairly frequently with couples in distress. And one or both will ask a question, something like, did I marry the wrong person? In a study done by a fellow internal family systems therapist named Jennifer Govan, I think that's how you say her name, in St. Louis, she found that 30% of divorced women certainly believed that they did. So that begs the question, how can so many people be getting it wrong? Was the other party so deceptive that they were fooled into believing something was false? Or perhaps they failed to listen to their own intuition and choose to marry anyway, only to discover later that they had made the most grievous mistake of their life. Perhaps it isn't about who you married, but rather your expectations of marriage. What are our expectations of marriage, and how do we determine whether or not we made a mistake? I remember when I was a kid, my mom and I were living in a little apartment in Richardson, Texas, and I remember my mom talking to one of her sisters and that the apartment complex wouldn't allow her to put nails in the wall to hang pictures. So she decided to try using straight pins. She said the straight pin wouldn't leave as big a hole and maybe it would hold some of the pictures that she wanted to hang. Her number one hobby was sewing, and she was an incredible seamstress. She had an ample supply of straight pins. She made my Halloween costumes and then my kids until her death about 11 years ago. But that's another story. When her pictures began crashing on the floor, we learned a valuable lesson, that you don't hang pictures on something unless you're sure it can bear the weight. And the same is true of marriage. Is the weight of our expectation for marriage more than it can possibly bear? Or does the problem lay within our spouse? To understand marriage and find answers to these questions, it's going to be helpful, I think, to take a historical look at the changing role of marriage in our culture. Up until the 1800s, we had this institutional marriage, which they were necessary for survival. And then after the Industrial Revolution, the purpose of marriage began to shift from survival to becoming more relational. And there was this sociologist, Andrew Cherlin, who referred to this new phenomenon at the time as companionship marriages. And those lasted from about 1850 to 1965. And then the counterculture movement of the mid-1960s was the birth of what we call this individualistic marriage. And marriage was no longer an absolute. It morphed into one of the several paths that we could take for personal fulfillment. And the purpose of marriage was now to make me happy. It was about finding a life with another who could complete you. And the individualistic marriage began shifting away from commitment to one of contentment. And if it's not making me happy, then perhaps I'd be better off or better served by something else or someone else. And once the weight of self-fulfillment was placed on the back of marriage, it's no wonder that the American divorce rate in the 60s and 70s began to soar. This newer model of marriage creates this natural pathway to wondering if you've made a mistake in choosing your spouse. If the goal of marriage is now personal fulfillment and I'm miserable, then my marriage is certainly failing to meet my needs and my expectations. And this quickly leads me to conclude that I might have married the wrong person. I am old enough to remember when marriage proposals were significant, but they weren't the grand event that they are today, that you hear about today. Marriage proposals were once an invitation to partner together in life. And they were typically done, they were done privately. In today's world, there's a new expectation that they may be this romantic, they have to be this romantic production, which communicates the depth of one's love for their future partner. And failure to make this proposal a big deal could be construed as a lack of love for one's potential bride. The proposal now carries new significance, and for some, it serves as a measure of how highly the bride is esteemed, as well as a predictor of the future of relational bliss. We began answering the question of whether this is the right person by the ability to make us feel good about ourselves. The shift from these love-based marriages to happiness-based marriages isn't just displayed in proposals. It's also measured by how much you're willing to sacrifice for my sake to make me happy. And this trend can even be seen, in television today. Instead of programs like I Love Lucy, reality TV shows such as Say Yes to the Dress and Bridezilla now capture a big chunk of the market share. How much are you willing to sacrifice to make me feel special? Determining whether or not this is the right person is often measured by the significance of the sacrifice you're willing to make for my sake. It's important to affirm that some people do marry the wrong person. Certainly abusive marriages where one party has no interest in ever being faithful, or marriages that have been abandoned must consider safety first. And there are some whose hearts are hard and who are only willing to show compassion or concern for themselves. Safety really is the issue, and continuing in a relationship where your mate isn't safe may be really unwise. I do believe there is a benefit and a potential in the current view of marriage. The danger is when an individual places the responsibility of their happiness on another person, failure is almost inevitable. We fail to see that my mate isn't my problem, but my mate reveals the problem in me. And that is by no means to say that your mate doesn't have issues or problems, but their issues trigger something in you. And what I believe that when we get triggered, that simply reveals that there's something inside of me that needs attention and it needs healing. 25 years ago, when I was seeing Rick for my infidelity, he very, very quickly pointed out and challenged my warped thinking about marriage. At that moment, I realized I'd been asking the wrong question all this time. It wasn't a question of whether I'd married the right person. I needed to be asking if I was being the right person. The first question placed an undue burden on both Amy and I and the marriage. And while the second placed the responsibility where it belonged, I needed to take personal responsibility for my own life rather than abdicating that responsibility and placing it on someone else. And my focus needed to be on becoming the best person I could be, someone I could respect, and someone I wanted to be with. Abandoning the quest for the right person and exchanging it for the quest to becoming the right person changed everything in my life back then. And it was a journey. It didn't happen overnight, but I began to think about it differently. When self-fulfillment is the goal, you risk of placing the responsibility of your happiness on your mate. And it won't be long till things get rocky and the lure of something else will catch your attention and possibly lead to infidelity. If you suffer from believing your happiness is your spouse's responsibility, it's far more likely that's your mate who has actually married the wrong person. Here are a few ways to determine whether your mate married the right person. Your mate may have married someone who's not being the right person if your primary focus is on what's wrong with the marriage rather than what's right with it. Or you live in a fantasy world dreaming about what would make you happy rather than learning to enjoy what you have or what you're learning together or how you're both growing together. Or you constantly think about what irritates you about them rather than focusing on what it must be like to live with you. Or if you believe you rarely make mistakes in this relationship. or you feel it's your responsibility to help your spouse become the right person rather than being the person who focuses on your own faults. And last, if you're watching or listening to this video, you're thinking this is something your spouse should watch rather than exploring how this applies to you. While it's more than possible for marriages to fill your needs for happiness and self-fulfillment, it requires a lot of ongoing work for both parties, individually and as a couple. When that happens, it's really a gift. It's not this inalienable right. And therefore, we need to celebrate the moments when it occurs and work at maintaining compassion and concern for your mate. Love always acts in the best interest of another. And I believe when love is my focus, I will then experience growth and fulfillment. I personally don't believe there is just one right person to marry. Marriage is God's primary people development tool, or at least one of them. If you think you've married the wrong person because you're not happy, then I'd like to invite you to consider the possibility that perhaps your spouse isn't the difficult one. And perhaps you might be a little more self-centered than you care to believe. I think we're all a little bit self-centered. But if happiness is the goal and marriage is the means, then you're not focusing on love. You've simply created this performance-based relationship, making it all about how well your partner does at meeting your needs. And this is for both people. If that's the case, then you might want to take a hard look at the expectations that you're placing on your marriage. For the sake of others, you might want to learn to do things differently. For now, what I'd like you to do is consider attending the EMS weekend or taking the EMS online course. I guarantee you that both options can help you and your spouse gain a new perspective on your marriage and set you on the right course of healing from infidelity. Check out the Affair Recovery website. All the information is there underneath the Programs tab. Thanks so much for joining me this week. It's always good to be with you. We at Affair Recovery keep hoping and praying that you're healthy and are all doing well. Know that we are here to support you in any way we can. Thanks so much for joining me.